March 16th, 1968. Sun Mai Village, Quảng Ngãi Province, South Vietnam. Chief Warrant Officer Hugh Thompson banked his OH-23 Raven observation helicopter low over rice paddies, searching for Viet Cong positions that intelligence reports insisted controlled the area. His crew chief Glenn Andriotta and gunner Lawrence Colburn scanned the ground from open doors, while morning sun burned through haze rising from irrigation ditches. But something contradicted everything reconnaissance missions were supposed to reveal. Thompson's helicopter drew no enemy fire, despite flying low and slow over supposedly hostile terrain. The village looked defenseless. Farmers' huts, civilians moving through paths, no fortifications visible. Then Thompson saw bodies, not combat casualties arranged in patterns that suggested firefight, but civilians scattered across fields in positions that suggested panic and flight. He radioed to mark wounded with green smoke, so ground forces could provide aid. When he circled back after refueling, those same wounded civilians were dead, shot at close range. In an irrigation ditch south of the village, Thompson counted dozens more bodies piled together, women, children, old men, and American soldiers from Charlie Company were still firing. What Thompson was witnessing wasn't combat operation against Viet Cong forces, but systematic massacre of unarmed civilians by United States Army troops, and in the next 20 minutes he would make decision that contradicted every chain of command protocol, landing his helicopter between American soldiers and Vietnamese villagers, ordering his crew to shoot fellow Americans if they continued killing, proving that sometimes the hardest enemy to confront wears the same uniform you do. The helicopters descended through morning haze at 7:22 a.m. on March 16, 1968. 9 UH-1 Hueys carrying Charlie Company's 1st platoon toward landing zone northwest of Sun Mai Village. Lieutenant William Calley watched from his position as rotor wash flattened rice paddies and dust spiraled upward. Intelligence briefings had warned that the 48th Viet Cong Battalion operated from this area, seasoned fighters who had inflicted casualties on Charlie Company during preceding weeks, through mines, booby traps, and sniper fire. The soldiers expected fierce resistance. They carried extra ammunition, grenades, and determination forged through frustration, a fighting enemy who melted into civilian population after each attack. This is what you've been waiting for. Search and destroy, and you've got it. Officers had told them during briefing. The village designated My Lai 4 on military maps supposedly housed Viet Cong command structure. That had been terrorizing American patrols for months. Sun Mai district held strategic importance in Quảng Ngãi Province, where Viet Cong controlled territory through network of sympathetic villages and intimidated populations. The area was heavily mined. Numerous Charlie Company soldiers had been maimed or killed during February and early March operations. Intelligence reports indicated major enemy presence concentrated around My Lai villages, making operation against 48th Battalion priority for Task Force Barker. Captain Ernest Medina had briefed his company that they would finally engage the elusive enemy who had been killing their friends through invisible warfare of explosives and ambush. The soldiers landed expecting the fight they had been denied for weeks. Clear target, definable enemy, opportunity for vengeance against forces that killed through cowardice rather than facing Americans in direct combat. But when 1st Platoon entered My Lai at 7:30 a.m., they encountered no resistance. No fortifications greeted them. No gunfire erupted from defensive positions. No males of fighting age appeared. Among about 700 villagers who were eating breakfast, women preparing morning meals, children playing near huts, elderly men tending animals, the village looked defenseless because it was defenseless. Yet within minutes of entering, soldiers began firing, not in response to threats, but as execution of unarmed civilians. Old men were bayoneted. Women praying near temple were shot in back of head. Children were killed alongside mothers. Cali ordered systematic advance through village, and his platoon obeyed without question, despite absence of enemy combatants or weapons. By 7:58 a.m., Captain Medina radioed Operations Center, reporting 15 Viet Cong killed, though no firefight had occurred and no enemy weapons had been recovered. Chief Warrant Officer Hugh Thompson flew overhead in OH-23 Raven Scout helicopter, part of aerial reconnaissance team surveying area south of My Lai villages. From altitude, the scene below appeared chaotic, but within parameters of combat operation. Soldiers moving through village, civilians fleeing, bodies visible, but explainable as combat casualties in area known for Viet Cong presence. Thompson had flown dozens of similar missions. The pattern seemed familiar, until details accumulated that contradicted combat logic. His helicopter drew no enemy fire, despite flying low and slow over supposedly hostile terrain. Bodies lay scattered in positions suggesting panic and flight, rather than defensive combat. Too many appeared to be women and children. The mathematics of battlefield casualties didn't align with what intelligence had predicted. Where was the 48th Battalion? Where were the fortifications? Where was return fire that should greet American assault on major enemy position? Thompson began noticing wrongness he couldn't yet articulate, sensing that ordinary search and destroy mission was transforming into something incomprehensible, and within next hour he would witness systematic massacre. That would force decision between chain of command loyalty and moral imperative to stop atrocity being committed by soldiers wearing same uniform he wore. Thompson spotted the wounded at 8:15 a.m. while conducting reconnaissance sweep south of My Lai village. 3 Vietnamese civilians lay in exposed ground, visible from air through breaks in vegetation. An elderly woman, a young mother, and a child who appeared to be moving despite injuries. Standard operating procedure for scout helicopter crews was clear. Mark wounded with colored smoke grenades so ground forces could provide medical evacuation. Thompson pulled green smoke canisters from equipment compartment and dropped them near the casualties, then keyed his radio. Got some wounded down here. Need help. The smoke billowed upward in bright plumes. That would be visible for 15 minutes. Unmistakable markers that screamed for attention from soldiers advancing through village below. Crew Chief Glenn Andriotta confirmed placement looked correct. Smoke close enough for ground forces to locate casualties quickly, but far enough to avoid obscuring victims. This was how the system worked, maintaining humanity amid warfare through simple procedure. That acknowledged wounded deserved treatment regardless of combatant status. Scout helicopter operations depended on coordination between air and ground elements. Pilots marked targets, directed fire, and identified casualties. Ground forces responded to signals, provided security, and evacuated wounded. The procedure had been refined through years of combat operations in Vietnam, creating expectation that when colored smoke appeared, soldiers would move toward it, prepared to render aid. Thompson felt reassured watching ground troops advance in general direction of his markers. The casualties would receive medical attention soon. He had done his part. Low fuel gauge demanded return to landing zone Dotty for refueling, and Thompson banked helicopter away from My Lai, knowing he had followed correct procedures. That should result in 3 wounded civilians being treated and evacuated. After refueling, Thompson returned to same area about 20 minutes later. His mission required continued reconnaissance over Sun Mai district, and he intended to verify that marked casualties had been recovered. He descended to lower altitude, searching for the positions where green smoke had dissipated. When he located the spot, Thompson's understanding of what was happening below began to shift. The 3 wounded Vietnamese he had marked were dead, not wounded, but awaiting evacuation. Dead. Bodies lying in positions that suggested they had been shot at close range after he marked them. Fresh blood indicated recent killing. No medics appeared nearby. No evacuation helicopter had arrived. Instead, American soldiers were visible throughout area, continuing to move through terrain while bodies accumulated behind their advance. Thompson's crew chief Andriotta called out what he was seeing below. More civilians dead in positions that made no tactical sense for combat casualties. Bodies clustered in ways that suggested execution rather than firefight. Thompson circled lower, watching soldiers herd groups of villagers into clusters. No enemy fire erupted from any position. His helicopter received no ground fire. Despite flying low and slow over area intelligence claimed was heavily defended Viet Cong stronghold, the mathematical impossibility of situation crystallized. He had marked 3 wounded civilians for rescue. American soldiers had advanced toward his smoke markers as if responding, yet those same civilians now lay dead from wounds inflicted after his marking. The conclusion defied belief, but evidence accumulated with each pass. American soldiers weren't providing aid to wounded. They were systematically executing civilians Thompson had tried to save, and the massacre he was witnessing wasn't aberration, but organized operation being conducted by entire company. That showed no signs of stopping until every unarmed villager was dead. Thompson spotted the irrigation ditch at about 9 a.m., while continuing reconnaissance south of My Lai village. From altitude, the depression appeared to be standard drainage feature, common throughout Vietnamese rice paddies. But as he descended for closer observation, the scale of horror became unmistakable. Bodies filled the ditch, women clutching children, elderly men, teenagers, piled together in grotesque arrangement that could only result from systematic execution. Thompson estimated 70 to 80 dead, though later counts would place number closer to 150. The bodies weren't arranged randomly as combat casualties would be. They lay stacked in patterns that suggested mass killing. Victims pushed together and shot methodically. Blood stained surrounding earth. Some bodies still moved. Wounded survivors trapped beneath dead. Children who hadn't yet died from injuries. Elderly attempting to crawl from carnage. Lieutenant William Calley had ordered 1st Platoon to herd civilians to this ditch. Throughout morning's advance through My Lai, villagers were gathered from homes and common areas, forced to walk at gunpoint to irrigation depression east of settlement. Once assembled, soldiers pushed them into ditch and opened fire with M16 rifles. Private First Class Paul Miadlo testified later that he expended several rifle magazines shooting women, children, and elderly packed together below. Calley personally participated in killing, firing alongside his men while ordering continued execution of civilians who were screaming "No VC" and attempting to shield children. The methodology confirmed what Thompson had been observing. This wasn't combat gone wrong or soldiers responding to perceived threats. This was systematic murder, organized, deliberate, carried out under orders, from officer who should have been protecting civilians, rather than orchestrating their extermination. Thompson landed his OH-23 helicopter between American soldiers and group of remaining Vietnamese civilians being herded toward the ditch. He shut down engine and stepped out, confronting ground forces who were preparing to execute another group of villagers. Thompson made split-second decision that would define rest of his life and challenge every assumption about military loyalty and chain of command. He ordered Crew Chief Glenn Andriotta and Gunner Lawrence Colburn to train their M60 machine guns on American soldiers surrounding position. If United States Army troops attempted to kill more civilians, Thompson's crew was authorized to shoot fellow Americans to prevent murders. The order violated every protocol regarding chain of command, potentially constituted mutiny, and placed 3 helicopter crewmen in direct confrontation with entire infantry platoon that had just spent hours systematically murdering unarmed villagers. The moment represented impossible moral calculus that military training couldn't address. Thompson wore same uniform as soldiers who had committed massacre. They were Americans, comrades, fellow servicemen fighting common enemy in difficult war, yet they had abandoned every principle that uniform supposedly represented: honor, protection of innocence, adherence to laws of war. Thompson's decision to point weapons at his own countrymen and threaten lethal force violated chain of command, but upheld higher law that distinguished soldiers from murderers. He was choosing conscience over obedience, moral imperative over institutional loyalty, proving that sometimes courage means opposing your own side when that side commits atrocity. But Thompson's intervention had stopped immediate killing without resolving larger problem. He now stood surrounded by soldiers who had just murdered hundreds of civilians, confronting officer who had ordered systematic execution, attempting to evacuate survivors while his tiny helicopter crew faced entire platoon. That possessed overwhelming firepower and demonstrated willingness to kill unarmed people without hesitation or remorse, creating situation where saving lives meant accepting possibility. That stopping massacre might cost his own. The My Lai operation violated every regulation governing lawful military conduct. Charlie Company received no hostile fire before soldiers began shooting civilians. Not a single weapon was recovered from bodies of victims. Targets included clearly identified non-combatants, elderly men, women, children, who posed no threat and offered no resistance, under laws of armed conflict codified through Geneva Conventions and Hague Conventions. Such actions constituted war crimes regardless of orders given. Military law established clear principle: soldiers possess not just right, but duty to refuse unlawful orders. Following illegal commands provides no defense under international law or uniform code of military justice. Lieutenant Calley's order to execute civilians being held at irrigation ditch was unlawful on its face, and soldiers who obeyed that order violated laws they had sworn to uphold. The Geneva Conventions of 1949, which United States had ratified, prohibited violence against persons taking no active part in hostilities. Article 3 specifically protected civilians from murder, mutilation, cruel treatment, and torture. The Hague Conventions established that combatants must distinguish between military targets and civilian populations. Targeting unarmed civilians constituted perfidy, violation of laws of war punishable under military and international criminal law. U.S. Army Field Manual 27-10, the law of land warfare, required soldiers to refuse orders that were palpably illegal. Executing unarmed civilians qualified as palpably illegal by any interpretation. Yet about 105 soldiers from Charlie Company participated in massacre or witnessed it without intervening, demonstrating how chain of command loyalty can override legal and moral obligations. When institutional pressure favors obedience over conscience, Thompson's decision to intervene, landing helicopter between American soldiers and Vietnamese civilians, ordering his crew to shoot fellow Americans if killing continued, appeared to violate chain of command, but actually represented correct application of military law. His actions upheld Geneva Conventions, Hague Conventions, and U.S. military code. When ground forces had abandoned all three, Thompson followed higher law that distinguished soldiers from murderers, proving that military discipline requires refusing unlawful orders rather than blindly obeying commanders who violate fundamental principles of lawful warfare. His intervention stopped immediate killing and saved about 11 Vietnamese civilians, children found hiding in bunker who Thompson evacuated, under protection of his helicopter crew's weapons. The impossible position Thompson faced, choosing between chain of command loyalty and moral/legal imperative to stop atrocity, revealed fundamental tension in military culture. Soldiers trained to follow orders without question because hesitation in combat kills. Yet absolute obedience creates condition. where criminal orders get executed by good soldiers, who believe following commands absolves them of responsibility for consequences. Most Charlie Company soldiers chose obedience that morning, participating in massacre or remaining silent while murders occurred around them. Thompson chose conscience, understanding that some orders must be refused regardless of rank structure or tactical situation. But Thompson's decision to report massacre up chain of command through proper channels would trigger institutional response opposite of what justice demanded. Cover-up orchestrated by commanders who prioritized unit reputation over accountability. Harassment of witnesses who testified truthfully, and vilification of Thompson himself by Americans who viewed his intervention as betrayal rather than heroism, proving that sometimes exposing atrocity committed by your own side creates more enemies than the original crime, and that moral courage often brings punishment rather than recognition from institutions that value loyalty over truth. Thompson returned to landing zone Dotty that evening and immediately reported what he had witnessed to his superiors. He provided detailed account of systematic civilian killings, described irrigation ditch filled with bodies, explained how he had intervened to stop executions and evacuate survivors. Thompson expected swift investigation and accountability. Massacre of hundreds of unarmed civilians demanded immediate response from chain of command. But the institutional machinery began moving in opposite direction. Initial reports from Task Force Barker claimed 128 Viet Cong killed with minimal civilian casualties during fierce firefight. Commanding officers congratulated Charlie Company on outstanding combat performance. Official press briefing that evening described successful operation in which American forces killed 128 enemy near Quảng Ngãi City, supported by helicopter gunships and artillery throughout day. Colonel Orrin Henderson, commander of 11th Infantry Brigade, received orders from American Division Executive Officer Brigadier General George Young to investigate reports of civilian casualties. Henderson interviewed several Charlie Company soldiers during late March and early April 1968, then issued written report concluding that about 20 civilians had been accidentally killed. Inadvertent casualties from long-range artillery fire and crossfire between American and Viet Cong forces. Henderson's report directly contradicted Thompson's testimony, and Vietnamese officials' reports that hundreds of civilians had been murdered and Sun Mai village virtually razed. Major General Samuel Coaster, commanding American Division, accepted Henderson's conclusions without ordering thorough investigation. Thompson's crew statements were filed away and forgotten. Official records characterized My Lai operation as resounding military success against 48th Viet Cong Battalion. The cover-up succeeded completely for 18 months. Massacre remained secret while war continued, and similar search and destroy operations proceeded throughout Quảng Ngãi Province. Officers who participated in suppression of evidence were promoted. Charlie Company received commendations. Thompson found himself assigned to increasingly dangerous missions with inadequate air cover. Punishment for reporting atrocity his commanders wanted buried. He was shot down 5 times over subsequent months, breaking his back in final crash that ended his combat flying career. No investigation materialized despite Thompson's repeated attempts to force accountability through proper channels. The institutional response demonstrated that maintaining unit reputation and avoiding scandal outweighed justice for hundreds of murdered civilians, but institutional pressure to bury truth couldn't silence all witnesses. Ronald Riddenhauer, helicopter door gunner who had trained with Charlie Company members, began informal investigation in April 1968, after hearing stories from soldiers who had participated in My Lai operation. Throughout remainder of his Vietnam tour, Riddenhauer gathered eyewitness testimony from multiple Charlie Company soldiers, documenting systematic execution of civilians after returning to United States and separating from Army. Riddenhauer spent months composing detailed letter, documenting Pinkville incident, operational nickname for My Lai area. On March 29, 1969, exactly 1 year after massacre, Ridenour mailed his report to 30 officials, including members of Congress, Pentagon leadership, State Department, and White House. Ridenour's letter forced response that officers had successfully avoided for years. Under mounting pressure, Army quietly charged Lieutenant Calley with 6 specifications of premeditated murder on September 9, 1969. But even then, military attempted to limit exposure by keeping charges secret and delaying court-martial. Investigative journalist Seymour Hersh learned of Calley's prosecution and began researching story. On November 13, 1969, 20 months after massacre, Hersh published detailed account through Dispatch News Service, breaking story in 35 newspapers nationwide. Week later, combat photographer Ronald Habel's color photographs of massacre victims appeared in Cleveland Plain Dealer, making cover-up impossible to maintain and forcing acknowledgement that American soldiers had committed atrocity their commanders had spent 18 months trying to hide. Lieutenant William Calley was charged on September 5, 1969, with 6 specifications of premeditated murder for deaths of 109 Vietnamese civilians. The Army announced charges quietly, hoping to avoid public attention, but investigative journalist Seymour Hersh broke the story in November 1969, forcing massacre into national consciousness. Calley's court-martial began November 17, 1970, at Fort Benning, Georgia, becoming most widely publicized military trial since Nuremberg. Prosecution called over 100 witnesses who testified to systematic execution of unarmed civilians, women, children, elderly, under Calley's direct orders. Photographic evidence from Army photographer Ronald Habel documented bodies piled in irrigation ditch, civilians moments before execution, aftermath of massacre that made denial impossible. Testimony revealed Calley had personally participated in killings, shooting Vietnamese monk after interrogation, throwing child into ditch and firing at him, expending 10 to 15 rifle magazines, executing civilians who offered no resistance. Calley's defense centered on claim that he followed orders from Captain Ernest Medina to kill everything in village. Whether Medina actually issued such order became central dispute. Medina testified at separate trial that he meant enemy soldiers, not civilians, and was acquitted of all charges in August 1971. Calley maintained that he interpreted "kill the enemy" to mean everyone in village, since intelligence briefings indicated no civilians would remain, only Viet Cong forces and sympathizers. Taking witness stand, Calley stated, "I was ordered to go in there and destroy the enemy. That was my job on that day. I did not sit down and think in terms of men, women, and children. They were all classified the same." He expressed no remorse, insisting he carried out lawful orders and did not feel wrong in doing so. On March 29, 1971, after 79 hours of deliberation, 6-officer jury convicted Calley of premeditated murder of 22 South Vietnamese civilians. 2 days later, he was sentenced to life imprisonment with hard labor at Fort Leavenworth. But conviction triggered unexpected backlash. Many Americans viewed Calley as scapegoat, ordinary soldier following orders in impossible war, punished for actions that superior officers had commanded and other soldiers had committed. President Richard Nixon immediately ordered Calley released from stockade to house arrest at Fort Benning, then launched review of case. Public opinion polls showed that majority of Americans opposed Calley's conviction. Georgia Governor Jimmy Carter proclaimed American Fighting Man's Day and asked Georgians to drive with headlights on to honor Calley. Of 26 officers and soldiers originally charged with participation in massacre or subsequent cover-up, only Calley was convicted. Charges against Captain Medina, Colonel Henderson, and other commanders were dismissed or resulted in acquittals. Despite evidence of ordering massacre, suppressing investigation, and creating conditions that made atrocity possible. Army reduced Cali's sentence to 20 years in August 1971, then to 10 years in April 1974. He became eligible for parole after serving 1/3 of sentence, just over 3 years, and was released November 1974. Cali returned to civilian life, eventually working in his father-in-law's jewelry store in Columbus, Georgia. Meanwhile, Hugh Thompson, who had stopped massacre by landing between American soldiers and Vietnamese civilians, threatening to shoot fellow Americans if killing continued, faced harassment and death threats from Americans who viewed his intervention as betrayal. Thompson testified against Cali and other soldiers during courts-martial, providing eyewitness account of systematic executions. For this, he received accusations of being traitor, coward, and liar. Peers Committee investigation concluded that failures of leadership, discipline, and morale across American division had created an environment where atrocity became possible, yet only lowest-ranking officer faced meaningful consequences, while commanders who ordered operation, suppressed evidence, and perpetuated cover-up avoided accountability, demonstrating that military justice system had failed at every level, except punishing one lieutenant who followed orders he claimed came from superiors, who successfully avoided prosecution for issuing them. Thompson returned from Vietnam to America that didn't want to hear what he had witnessed. He faced hostility from fellow soldiers, veterans groups, and civilians, who viewed his intervention at My Lai as betrayal rather than heroism. Anonymous death threats arrived at his home. Former comrades avoided him. During congressional testimony, one representative told Thompson that he was the only American who should be punished over My Lai, not soldiers who had committed massacre, but pilot who had stopped it. For decades, Thompson struggled with post-traumatic stress disorder, survivors' guilt over not arriving at My Lai earlier, and isolation from military community that should have celebrated his courage, but instead treated him as pariah who had turned weapons on fellow Americans. My Lai divided America along fault lines that exposed fundamental disagreements about war, duty, and morality. Some viewed massacre as aberration that proved Vietnam War's corrupting influence, evidence that impossible conflict in ambiguous terrain against invisible enemy had destroyed moral compass of ordinary American soldiers. Others defended Charlie Company as men following orders in unwinnable situation, arguing that Lieutenant Cali had been scapegoated for actions that commanders had implicitly authorized through rules of engagement, prioritizing body counts over civilian protection. Thompson became lightning rod in this cultural rift. Those who saw massacre as symptom of systemic failure recognized Thompson as hero, who upheld American values when institution abandoned them. Those who defended soldiers viewed Thompson as traitor, who had pointed weapons at his own countrymen, rather than accepting that sometimes following orders means participating in atrocity. March 6, 1998, exactly 30 years after My Lai, U.S. Army finally awarded Thompson and his crew Soldiers' Medals. At ceremony near Vietnam Veterans Memorial in Washington, D.C., Major General Michael Ackerman presented medals, recognizing heroism above and beyond the call of duty for saving lives of at least 10 Vietnamese civilians during unlawful massacre. Glenn Andreotta received his medal posthumously. He had been killed in combat 3 weeks after My Lai, dying before truth about massacre became public, and before his intervention could be acknowledged. Lawrence Colburn stood beside Thompson, accepting recognition. That vindicated decision they had made 3 decades earlier. It was the ability to do the right thing, even at the risk of their personal safety. That guided these soldiers to do what they did, Ackerman stated. They set the standard for all soldiers to follow. The ceremony represented more than belated recognition of individual courage. It established official acknowledgement that moral law supersedes chain of command. When the two conflict, irreconcilably. Thompson's story demonstrated that sometimes greatest courage means standing against your own community, accepting isolation and vilification to uphold principles when group abandons them. His decision to land helicopter between American soldiers and Vietnamese civilians, ordering crew to shoot fellow Americans if necessary, defied every tribal instinct that binds military units together, yet that decision represented correct application of values American military claimed to embody: protecting innocent life, refusing unlawful orders, maintaining honor, even when expedient path involves participation in war crimes. Thompson died January 6, 2006, at age 62 from cancer. His legacy is measured not just in 11 Vietnamese civilians he saved that morning at My Lai, but in generations of soldiers taught through his example. That following conscience can require defying commanders. His story appears on U.S. Army Chief of Staff's professional reading list. Military ethics courses examine his decision as case study in moral courage. The Hugh Thompson Foundation perpetuates his memory and principles. What Thompson proved at My Lai remains uncomfortable truth for any institution dependent on obedience. Sometimes the hardest enemy to confront wears same uniform you do, and sometimes heroism means choosing humanity over tribal loyalty when the two conflict. Accepting that moral courage often brings punishment from those who value silence over truth. And understanding that real patriotism sometimes requires saving your country's honor by stopping crimes committed in its name.